Some voters literally spent hours in line to do something that was more to them than just connecting the line on a piece of paper. Reporter Julia Thatcher spoke with some folks who waited hours just to vote.
I cannot even begin to imagine the amount of people that have already gone through those voting booths. What surprised me most about today, however, was that everyone I spoke with was in a surprisingly good mood despite the lines.
An hour and a half.
Hour and a half.
Oh, it's 2 hours.
Parking lots were packed and lines were long. But can you believe just how long some were? Hundreds of people gathered at 7th Avenue in Glendale to cast their ballots, and all for different reasons.
A lot of good men died so I could stand in line to vote.
Because I feel like this is the first year where it's actually going to make a difference, and there's a huge amount of people that are actually going out to vote this year, and I want to be a part of that.
Seeing this many people wait in line made us curious if the turnout was anticipated.
Obviously not as long as they have been.
But one of the biggest culprits for the long lines?
The reason why we kind of condensed to 60 polling places is because the majority of our voters are not eligible to vote in today's election because they are independent voters, unfortunately.
The county court reporter's office said part of the preparations for today was making sure independent voters didn't show up to polling locations, but they said thousands still did. But the long lines didn't stop people from sitting in the sun and waiting their turn to make their voices heard. 98-year-old Mary DeWorth waited an hour in line before they brought her in from the sun to cast her vote.
Well, I think it's important to vote, and everybody should get out to vote.
The county court recorder's office stressed the importance that if you are registered as an independent, that you stay home. It will only create delays if you do vote, but if you are eligible, you can visit any of the voting locations. In Phoenix, Julia Thatcher, Cronkite News.
This is why they could be concerned about problems at the polls. Take a look at this video. Lines to vote wrapping around 2 corners, and it just keeps going.
Polling places are still dealing with the extreme voter turnout, staying open hours later than originally planned. Cronkite News reporter Jackie Padilla spent time at one of the busy polling places where voters waited patiently to cast their ballots.
Hurry up and wait. That's something voters throughout Arizona experienced as they stood in line to cast their ballot for the presidential preference election.
God, I did wait in line for 3 hours. Did not expect that, but it was worth it.
With such a long wait, people found creative ways to pass the time.
Yeah, there's a lady in front of us who kept marking the whole process in chalk and just little notes to the rest of us. And when we reached about here, we hit about 71.
It was a lot of standing around, or in Victoria Byron's case, sitting.
Do you think people are jealous of your chairs?
Absolutely. We've been told that we're smart about 1,000,000 times. And it was really per chance that they were in my truck.
At 7 p.m., the polls closed, and this official had to turn away anyone who tried to get in line after that.
I don't go home till they're done.
Leaving hopeful voters disappointed.
They said, well, I'm at the end of the line, so that you didn't make it. So that was it.
But Pauline Begay, who was with her son, made it just in time to cast one of the last ballots.
The guy behind me said, the line is closed now. So we're like, everybody was like, all right, you made it. So everybody was hollering.
It was clear today that despite the long wait, many voters felt it was important to fulfill their civic duty. In downtown Phoenix, Jackie Padilla, Cronkite News.
Across the 60 polling precincts in Maricopa County, one in North Phoenix was so crowded, parking was scarce.
Volunteers were handing out water bottles to voters who had been waiting in line for hours.
I would really like to know why there are only 60 polling places for this election.
The longest I've ever waited in line is like 10 minutes, and that's in any election.
Voters filled the sidewalks this evening around the Church of Beatitudes in North Phoenix. The line reached around the church and down the street from 7th Avenue to 4th Avenue along Glendale Road, right as polls were closing at 7. Some voters were told wait times could reach up to 4 hours. However, everyone in line by 7 was guaranteed the opportunity to cast a ballot.
And those polling complaints are causing headaches for the county elections officials.
Jesse Schultz went to the Maricopa County Recorder and Elections Office to get some answers. Many people are looking for someone to blame due to the long lines and frustrations at polling sites around Maricopa County. Shortly after the office released early ballot results, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were already calling it a win, despite the fact that many people in Maricopa County were still waiting in lines to cast their vote. Officials from the office say they understand the frustration, but are just doing their job.
I'm just following what the law says, that we release the returns an hour after the polls close, and that's what we've done.
I completely understand if the totals are already posted online, that they can feel discouraged, but they should not.
The office says that despite some negative feedback, it plans to work on voter outreach by making polling sites and registration information more available and making sure independent voters know that they cannot vote in presidential preference elections. In the broadcast center, Jesse Schultz, Cronkite News.
Voters and politicians alike are calling yesterday's Arizona presidential preference election a disaster. Secretary of State Michelle Reagan just announced that her office would launch a full-scale statewide review. And Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton called for an official Department of Justice investigation into voting delays and reduced polling locations. Cronkite News reporters Audrey Wheel and Ben Marjat are live at the Capitol with the fallout from Tuesday night.
In case you missed it, voters lined the streets until past midnight, some of them giving up, others getting to the end of the line only to find out that they couldn't vote. The reason for such long lines, Maricopa County reduced the amount of polling places from 200 a few years ago to 60 this year.
I spoke to one Maricopa County supervisor who says that was the worst election he's ever seen. He voiced his concerns a month ago, but says they fell on deaf ears to a board of supervisors who ultimately approved the polling plans.
They didn't think, oh, this is a really big election, we got an increase in early ballots, we should increase the precinct polls.
Protesters demanded answers this morning outside the Maricopa County Recorder's office.
It's outrageous. We're calling on the County Board of Supervisors to get some answers.
And that answer is money. This video shows Maricopa County Elections Director Karen Osborne speaking to the Board of Supervisors just last month.
We have had, at your direction, to try and keep the pres preference as cheap as humans could do it.
District 5 Supervisor Steve Gallardo defends the board, saying election officials didn't ask for more money.
Not once did they ever say, we don't have enough money to conduct this election. If money was an issue, I need them to come talk to us so we can address the issue. The fact is, this was just poor judgment on their part.
And today, Maricopa County Recorder Helen Purcell admitted to that.
I take full responsibility for what happened yesterday.
I brought it up. I brought it up back in February that this was going to be an issue. 60 polling places was questionable. I knew from the get-go that we had a lot of excitement. We saw it in New Hampshire, we saw it in Iowa, we saw it in every early primary state, the record number of voter participation.
But the county recorder said the number of polling places was determined scientifically.
That scientific method, unfortunately, is garbage.
Gallardo says after yesterday's disaster, the board is focusing on making sure this doesn't happen in future elections, especially during a busy election year.
And Democratic politicians are speaking out today, saying the long lines meant that many voters were disenfranchised at the polls, which may have affected certain districts more than others.
It was a huge failure for our democratic process and our democratic system yesterday.
No matter how you look at it, last night's presidential preference election was chaos, with some voters having to wait in line for over 5 hours and others being turned away completely. But today, Democratic lawmakers are saying it affected some groups of voters more than others.
Anytime you reduce the number of options to vote, fewer people vote, period.
And in the West Valley, in the Maryvale area, in the Glendale area, South and West Glendale, there was only one polling place in that entire area. The polling places were very spread out in the West Valley, and that's really disappointing given the high minority population in that area.
Quezada said low-income and minority voters who are more reliant on public transportation were less likely to make it to the polls, and even those that did make it to a polling place had to wait hours to cast their ballots, long after both races were already called.
Because the polling places were limited, which resulted in longer lines, which resulted in the races being called before people cast their votes, you saw a number of voters that said, well, the race is over, I'm just going to go home now.
Some called for Maricopa County Recorder Helen Purcell to step down.
And when the public tells them that they are no longer wanted, they are no longer needed, they are no longer qualified, that public servant needs to listen.
It's clear that she was not interested in letting the democratic will of the people be heard, and it was clear voter suppression that should be punished.
Now, Helen Purcell came out and said she will not be resigning, but as an elected official, she is up for re-election this year. One of the state senators speaking out, Democrat Andrew Sherwood. And Democrat Andrew Sherwood, I'm joined with him now. Senator Sherwood, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been around a lot of elections. Just how bad was this one?
Yes, sir. This is going to be my 4th consecutive election cycle I'm going into right now. This is definitely the worst election cycle I've ever seen. I've never heard stories about running out of ballots, problems parking, long lines in tune of 5, 6, 7 hours, and party voter registration problems. These complications have never happened like this, and they should never happen again.
And you said there's one polling place in your district that was hit a little bit harder than some of the other ones?
Yeah, my district has 4 polling locations, but 2 of them were hit very hardly. We had voters who got in line at 5 p.m. and they were still in line hours and hours after that. They had trouble parking. So yeah, absolutely. This just isn't my district though. This is all of Maricopa County.
And what's going to be done over the next few weeks and months to make sure that this doesn't happen in November?
Yeah, well, I proposed 4 bills earlier this session, and I know that my Senate Democrats and my House Democrats, they've been working hard to try to find solutions. We're talking about automatic voter registration. We're talking about extending polling hours. We're talking about additional polling locations. These are things that we've been proposing here years, and we haven't heard, these bills haven't even gotten a hearing yet in committee.
Thank you so much, Senator Andrew Sherwood. We're going to send it back to Zach and Amber in the studio.
In the state legislature, there are actually 2 bills that would do away with the taxpayer-funded presidential preference election in Arizona altogether. Senate Bill 1486 and House Bill 2567 both passed in their respective chambers. They would repeal the presidential preference election, refund $6 million from the general fund to county elections, and leave all future decisions and costs up to the political parties, which could lead to caucuses instead of a taxpayer-funded election. For more fallout from the presidential preference election, visit cronkitenews.azpbs.org, and be sure to check out our Store 5 for the problems at the polls.